She was lost in the wilds of Pennsylvania. Fiona Flanagan peered through her windshield, trying to decipher which of the narrow roads the tilted signpost pointed to. Maybe this wasn't really the wilds, but the only living creature she'd encountered in the last 15 minutes was the brown and white cow that stared mournfully at her from its pasture next to the road. Clearly the cow wasn't going to help. She frowned down at the map drawn by one of her numerous Flanagan cousins, and decided that squiggly line probably meant she should turn right. She could always phone her cousin Gabe, but she shrank from having to admit she couldn't follow a few simple directions. Both he and his wife had volunteered to drive her or to get one of his siblings to drive her, but she'd insisted she could do this herself. The truth was that she'd spent the past 2 weeks feeling overwhelmed by the open friendliness offered by these relatives she'd never met before. She'd spent so many years feeling like an outsider in her father's house that she didn't know how to take this quick acceptance. The pastures on either side of the road gave way to fields of corn stalks, yellow and brown in October. Maybe that was a sign that she was approaching civilization. Or not. She could find her way around her native San Francisco blindfolded, but the Pennsylvania countryside was another story. The road rounded a bend and there, quite suddenly, was a cluster of houses and buildings that had to be the elusive hamlet she'd been seeking. Crossroads, the village was called, and it literally was a crossroads, a collection of dwellings grown up around the point at which two of the narrow blacktop roads crossed. Relieved, she slowed the car, searching for something that might be a for sale sign. The real estate agent with whom she'd begun her search had deserted her when he couldn't interest her in any of the sterile, bland, modern buildings he'd shown her on the outskirts of the busy small city of Suffolk. But she didn't want suburban, she wanted the country. She had a vision of her practice as a nurse midwife in a small community where she'd find a place to call home. Through the gathering dusk she could see the glow of house lights in the next block. But most of the village's few businesses were already closed. She drove by a one-pump service station, open, and a minuscule post office, closed. The Penn Dutch Diner had a few lights on, but only 5 cars graced its parking lot. The Crossroads General Store, also closed, sat comfortably on her right, boasting a display of harness and tack in one window and an arrangement of what had to be genuine Amish quilts in the other. And there, next to it, was the sign she'd searched for sale. She drew up in front of the house. It had probably once been a charming Victorian, but now it sagged sadly, as if ashamed of such signs of neglect as cracked windows and peeling paint. But it had a wide, welcoming front porch, with windows on either side of the door, and a second floor that could become a cozy apartment above her practice. For the first time in days of searching, excitement bubbled along her nerves. This might be it. If she squinted, she could picture the porch bright with autumn flowers in window boxes, a calico cat curled in the seat of a wicker rocker, and a neat brass plate beside the front door, Fiona Flanagan, nurse midwife. Home. The word echoed in her mind, setting up a sweet resonance. Home. She slid out of the car, taking the penlight from her bag. Tomorrow she could get the key from the reluctant real estate agent, but she'd at least get a glimpse inside in the meantime. She hurried up the 3 steps to the porch, avoiding a nasty gap in the boards, and approached the window on the left. The feeble gleam of the penlight combined with the dirt on the window to thwart her ability to see inside. She rubbed furiously at the glass with a tissue. At a minimum she needed a waiting room, office and exam room, and what do you think you're doing? A gruff voice barked out the question, and the beam of a powerful light hit her like a blow, freezing her in place. Well? Turn around and let me see you. Heart thudding, she turned slowly, the penlight falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. I was just looking. Great. She sounded guilty even to herself. The tall, broad silhouette loomed to enormous proportions with the torchlight in her eyes. She caught a glimpse of some metallic official insignia on the car that was pulled up in front of hers. The man must have realized that the light was blinding her because he lowered the beam fractionally. Come down off the porch. She scrabbled for the wandering penlight, grabbed it and hurried down the steps to the street, trying to pull herself together. Really, she was overreacting. The man couldn't be as big and menacing as she was imagining. But at ground level with him, she realized that her imagination wasn't really that far off. He must have stood well over 6 feet, with a solid bulk that suggested he was as immovable as one of the nearby hills. In the dim light, she made out a craggy face that looked as if it had been carved from rock. A badge glinted on his chest. She rushed to explain. "Really, I didn't mean any harm. I understand this building is for sale, and I just wanted to have a quick look. I can come back tomorrow with the real estate agent." She turned toward her car. Somehow, without giving the impression that the mountain had moved, the man managed to be between her and the vehicle. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. She was alone in a strange place, with a man who was equally strange, and her cell phone was in her handbag, which lay unhelpfully on the front seat of the car she couldn't reach. "Not so fast," he rumbled. "Let's see some identification, please." At least she thought he said please. That slow rumble was a little difficult to distinguish. She could make out the insignia on his badge now, and her heart sank. Crossroads Township Police. Why couldn't she have fallen into the hands of a nice, professional state trooper, instead of a village cop who probably had an innate suspicion of strangers? "My driver's license is in my car," she pointed out. Wordlessly, he stood back for her to pass him and then followed her closely enough to open the door before she could reach the handle. She grabbed her wallet, pulling out the California driver's license and handing it to him. "California." He seemed to pronounce all of the syllables separately. "Yes, California." Nerves edged her voice. "Is that a problem, officer?" She snapped her mouth shut before she could say anything else. Don't make him angry. Never argue with a man who's wearing a large badge on his chest. Could be. She blinked. She almost thought there was a thread of humor in the words. He handed the ID back. "What brings you to Crossroads Township, Ms. Flanagan?" "I'm looking for a house to buy. Someone from the real estate office mentioned this place. I got a little lost, or I'd have been here earlier." She shifted her weight uneasily from one foot to the other as she said the words. That steady stare made her nervous. He couldn't really detain her for looking in a window, could he? She looked up, considering saying that, and reconsidered at the sight of a pair of intense blue eyes in a stolid face made up entirely of planes. Don't say anything to antagonize him. I see. He invested the 2 words with a world of doubt. You have anyone locally who can vouch for you? Finally she realized what she should have sooner. Of course she had someone to vouch for her. She had a whole raft of cousins. Family. Not a word that usually had much warmth for her, but maybe now. Ted Rittenhouse saw the relief that flooded the woman's face. She'd obviously come up with a solution she thought would satisfy him. I'm staying with a cousin, Gabe Flanagan. She was so relieved that the words tripped over each other. She snatched a cell phone from her bag. Look, you can call him. He'll vouch for me. Here's my cell phone. You can use it. Seems to me I've heard of those newfangled gadgets, he said dryly, pulling his own cell phone from his uniform pocket. You have his number? Even in the dim light provided by the dome lamp of her car, he could see the color that flooded her fair skin at that. He assessed her while he punched in the number she gave him. Slim, erect, with a mane of strawberry blonde hair pulled back from a heart-shaped face. A pair of intelligent gray eyes met his directly, in spite of the embarrassment that heightened her color. Something about the cut of her tan slacks and corduroy jacket suggested a bit more sophistication than was usually found in Crossroads Township, where the standard attire was jeans, except for the plain people. Mr. Flanagan? This is Ted Rittenhouse, Crossroads Township Police. I've got a young lady here who says she's staying with you. Fiona Flanagan, her name is. Fiona? She's my cousin. Quick concern filled the man's voice, wiping away some of Ted Rittenhouse's suspicion. Potential housebreakers didn't usually come equipped with respectable-sounding relatives. Has she had a car accident? What's wrong? Nothing wrong. She maybe got a little lost is all. I'll guide her back to your place all right. The Pennsylvania Dutch cadence, wiped from his voice during his years in the city, had come back the instant he'd moved back home to Crossroads. "If you'll just give me directions." As Flanagan gave him the directions, Ted realized he knew exactly where that farm was. The next township over, but he knew most of the back roads and landmarks in the county, even if that area wasn't his jurisdiction. Somehow you never forget the land that meant home when you were a kid. Maybe that was especially true of a place like this, where the same families had owned farms for generations. When he slid the phone back in his pocket, he realized Ms. Flanagan was watching him with wariness in those clear eyes. "It's not necessary for you to guide me anywhere. I can get back to my cousins on my own." "No problem at all. It's not out of my way. I'll guide you there." "I'd prefer to go alone." She enunciated the words as if he was a dumb hick who couldn't understand. Well, fair enough. In her eyes, he probably was. But he wasn't going to let her just disappear, not until that last faint suspicion was cleared up. As the law in the township, he was responsible and he took it seriously. "Sorry, ma'am. You heard me tell your cousin I'd guide you home, and I'm not about to let you get lost again." For a moment longer she glared at him, sensing he was poking mild fun at her. Then she jerked a nod, as if to admit defeat, and rounded her car to slide into the driver's seat. He paused, flashing the light around the old Landers place and then over Ruth Moser's general store next door. Be a good thing if someone bought the Landers place. It had been standing empty too long. But Ruth wouldn't appreciate it if someone up and put a phony Pennsylvania Dutch tourist trap right next to her shop. Course he didn't know what the Flanagan woman had in mind for the building. He didn't think anyone who dressed like she did would sell plastic Amish dolls made in some third world country. No sign of life in the general store, and everything looked locked up tight. He'd advised Ruth to put in an alarm system, but so far she hadn't listened. Folks liked to think this was still the quiet countryside it had been 50 years ago, but that wasn't so. He walked back to the patrol car and slid in. Vandalism, petty crime, the theft of some handmade Amish quilts out at Moses Schmidt's place. Even Crossroads Township had its share of crime. And when he'd pinned this badge on, he'd made a vow to protect and to serve. A familiar pang went through him at the thought. He pulled out, watching the rearview mirror to be sure the Flanagan woman pulled out behind him. He thought he'd made the right choice in coming back home after the trouble in Chicago, but maybe a man could never know until the end of his life if he'd been following God's leading or his own inclinations. As it was, there were those he loved who'd never understand his choices. Thank the Lord, they were willing to love him anyway. At least he'd been coming back to something he knew when he'd come here. What on earth would bring a woman like Fiona Flanagan to buy a place here? The address on her driver's license was San Francisco. Did she have some pie-in-the-sky dream of rural bliss? If so, she'd no doubt be disappointed. He'd frightened her when he'd accosted her so abruptly, and he was sorry for that. All he'd seen had been a dark figure at the window of the empty house, and he'd reacted automatically. Still, she'd recovered soon enough, ready to flare up at him in an instant. There was the gate to the Flanagan farm. When he saw the fanciful sign with its cavorting animals, recollection began to come. He'd heard about this place, they trained service animals for the disabled. If she really belonged here, Miss Flanagan was probably all right. She tooted her horn, as if to say that he could leave her now. Instead, he turned into the lane and drove up to the house. It was full dark, and it wouldn't hurt to see the woman safely into her cousin's hands. The farmhouse door opened the moment his lights flashed across the windows, and a man waited outside by the time he came to a stop. The other car drew up under the willow tree with a little spurting of gravel, as if the driver's temper were not quite under control. He got out, leaving the motor running as he took the hand the man extended. "I'm Ted Rittenhouse." "Good to meet you, Gabe Flanagan." Flanagan turned to his cousin, who came toward them reluctantly, probably too polite to just walk away from him. "Fiona, we were getting a little worried when you weren't back by dark. I'm glad you ran into someone who could help you get home." She managed a smile, but he suspected she was gritting her teeth. Officer Rittenhouse was very helpful. It was my pleasure, ma'am. He would have tipped his hat, but he'd left it in the car. I hope you'll stop by and see me if you ever come to Crossroads again. I'd be glad to be of help to you. I'm sure that won't be necessary. Thank you for leading me back. She hesitated a moment, and then she held out her hand. Surprised, he took it. It felt small but strong in his. Good night, Ms. Flanagan. Good night. She might have wanted to add, good riddance, but either manners or common sense kept a slight smile on her face. She turned and walked toward the house, her back very straight. Fiona crossed the guest bedroom at Gabe and Nolly's farmhouse a few days later, charmed again by the curve of the sleigh bed and the colorful patchwork quilt. Maybe she'd have something like that in her new house. Her house, officially, as of 10 o'clock this morning. She had to admit she'd hesitated about buying the place in Crossroads after her experience there the other night. But the house was irresistible, and, in the clear light of day, she had to admit the police officer was just doing his duty. Besides, the lure of the place overrode everything else. Home, it kept saying to her. Home. Crossroads, she'd learned, was a fairly large area, encompassing several small villages on the outskirts of Suffolk, as well as farmland. Surely a township police officer like Ted Rittenhouse would be too busy with his other duties to bother about her. Or to annoy her. She picked up her jacket and slipped it on. October had abruptly turned chilly, at least for the day. Still, anyone who'd grown up in San Francisco was used to changeable weather. That wouldn't bother her. She paused at the dresser, letting her fingers slip across the painted surface of the rectangular wooden box she brought with her across the country. It was all she had of the mother she'd never known. How much had that influenced her decision to come here? She wasn't sure, and she didn't like not being sure about something so important. When her advisor in the nurse midwife program had mentioned that his part of Pennsylvania had a growing need for midwives, something had lit up inside her. Some instinct had said that here she'd find what she was looking for, even if she didn't quite know what it was. That's a replica of a dower chest, Nolly spoke from the doorway. It's lovely. Did you buy it here? Fiona smiled at her hostess. With her fresh, scrubbed face, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, jeans and flannel shirt, Nolly Flanagan looked more like a teenager than a busy wife and mother, as well as an accomplished trainer of service animals for the disabled. I brought it with me. It was my mother's. She hoped the shadow she felt when she said the words didn't show in her voice. I hate to show my ignorance, but what is a dower chest? Nolly came closer, tracing the stiff, painted tulips with their green leaves, fat little hearts and yellow stars in circles that decorated the box. A traditional dower chest is much larger than this, like a cedar chest, for Pennsylvania Dutch girls to store the linens they make in preparation for their wedding. This smaller one was probably for a child to keep her treasures in. It hadn't occurred to her that Nolly would be a source of information, but her Aunt Siobhan had said that Nolly's family had lived on this farm for generations. When you say Pennsylvania Dutch, do you mean Amish? Nolly leaned against the dresser, apparently willing to be distracted from whatever chores called her. The Amish are Pennsylvania Dutch, but not all Pennsylvania Dutch are Amish. She grinned. Confusing, I know. And to add to the confusion, we aren't really Dutch at all. We're of German descent. William Penn welcomed the early German immigrants, including the Amish. They've held on to their identity better than most because of their religious beliefs. It can't be easy, trying to resist the pressures of the modern world. No. There are always those who leave the community, like your mother. Fiona blinked. I didn't realize you knew about her. Distress showed in Nolly's blue eyes. I'm sorry, I didn't pry, honestly. Siobhan mentioned it, when she told us you were coming. Her Aunt Siobhan and Uncle Joe knew about her mother, probably more than she did, of course. During the week she'd spent in their house she'd wondered if they'd talk about her mother, or about the reason her father hadn't spoken to his brother in over 25 years. But they hadn't, and Fiona was too accustomed to not rocking the boat to mention it herself. In any case, the breach between brothers meant they'd know little of what happened after her parents left. It's all right. I don't know much about her myself. She died shortly after I was born. I'm sorry, Nolly said again. But your father must have spoken of her. No, she transferred her gaze to the chest, because that was easier than looking into Nolly's candid eyes. My father couldn't take care of me, I was in foster care for years. By the time I went to live with him, he'd remarried. And he hadn't particularly wanted reminders of that early mistake. She wouldn't say that. She wasn't looking for pity, and she'd already said more than she'd intended. Nolly's hand closed over hers, startling her, and she repressed the urge to pull away. I know what that's like. I was in foster care too. And with a great-aunt who didn't want me. It can be tough to get past that sometimes. Fiona's throat tightened in response, but the habit of denial was too ingrained. She used the movement of picking up her handbag to draw away. It was a long time ago. I don't think much about it now. At least, she tried not to. Nolly made some non-committal sound that might have been doubt or agreement, but she didn't push. I suppose you'll want to look up your mother's family, too, now that you're here. Fiona shook her head. She'd been over this and over it, and she was sure she'd made the right decision. I don't plan to do that. It's not the same thing as coming to see the Flanagan family. Aunt Siobhan always tried to keep in touch, and I knew she'd be glad to see me. But they probably, no, that sounded too curt. She'd have to explain, at least a little. My mother's family never made any effort to contact me. The one time my father spoke to me about it, he said they'd rejected my mother for marrying him. It's hardly likely they'd want to see me. You can't be sure of that. Nolly's face was troubled. I'd be glad to help you find them. Or maybe that police officer you met could help. No. Thanks anyway. She forced a smile. I appreciate it, but I've made my decision. I don't want to find them. Because they rejected your mother? The small voice in the back of her mind was persistent. Or because you're afraid they might reject you? If that's what you want, Nolly began, but her words were interrupted by a wail from downstairs. Oh. She smiled. Sounds like trouble. That music video keeps her happy for a half hour, but then only mommy will do. All my years of taking care of animals didn't prepare me for the demands of one small human. And you love it. Fiona picked up her corduroy jacket and handbag. Go ahead, take care of little Siobhan. I'm fine, really. Nolly nodded. If you ever want to talk, thanks. I'm okay. The wail soared in pitch, and Nolly spun and trotted down the steps. Mommy's coming. It's all right. Fiona followed more slowly. The maternal love in Nolly's face was practically incandescent. Seeing that when it happened for the first time was one of the best rewards of being a midwife. Once her practice got on its feet, she'd have that opportunity again and again. She was off to take possession of her new house, the first step toward her new life. Lord, please bless this new beginning. Help me not to dwell on the difficulties of the past, but only on the promises of the future.